Alright, so before we get into this React world, you have to make sure that your machine has this Node.js and the npm is installed in your system. So these tools are important modern web development, and you don't need to know a lot about these tools, but they have to have installed on your machine. So now let me explain what they are. So consider this Node.js and npm. So npm stands for Node Package Manager. These are the engine room that brings life to web development when you are working with React. So what is Node.js? So you already know JavaScript code runs on the browser. What Node.js does is it runs your code so outside of the browser. So due to that, it provides all sort of server-side operations and executions of scripts more smoothly. And Node.js is like engine that powers everything. It allows us to run JavaScript code outside of the browser, which is crucial because React is all about building user interfaces using JavaScript. Now Node.js provides the environment in order to execute React code on your computers. And this other is npm, and it stands for Node Package Manager. React is a library and often needs other little pieces of code, and these pieces of code called as a packages to work smoothly. These packages are essential. So npm helps us to easily manage and install these packages so you don't have to build everything from the scratch. So in terms of that, npm is important. So in a nutshell, we need Node.js to run our React code, and npm helps us to manage and organize the additional tools or the packages that makes developing with the React more efficient. So let's make sure that these npm and Node.js is already installed in your system. So open up your command prompt or terminal and type this command. So node then space dash v. This v stands for the version. So as you can see, I already have the Node.js installed in my system, and it's showing its version number here. And let's check npm. So npm, again the same thing, npm space dash and then version. So here npm is also installed in my system. So if you got an error rather than these numbers, these version numbers while doing this, then don't worry, I'm going to walk you through the process of how to download this Node.js and npm. And one more thing I want you to know is when you download and install Node.js, npm is included with it. So npm gets installed automatically as a part of Node.js installation process, and you don't have to install npm separately. It comes with this Node.js. So once Node.js is installed on its system, you can use npm to install other packages and stuff. So let's install this Node.js. So go to this node.org here, and you will find here multiple versions options. So choose the one that matches your operating system. Since I am on Windows, I already have Node installed, so I'm not going to install it. Now download this Node version and proceed with the installation on your system. And after completing the installation process, let's double check the version to ensure it was installed successfully. So simply we have to simply revisit the command prompt again and verify the version here. So again the same process, node space dash and then version, and here you can see your version that you have installed earlier. So then let's learn about the components and template. So these components are building blocks of any React application, and a typical web page built with React might be made of several different components, where each component is normally a self-contained section of content. For example, a navbar in a website might be a component, an article might be a component, and a sidebar might be a component. So it's basically our job as a developer to create these components, which are then shown in web page by the React. Now each of these components will contain all of its own templates and all of their own logic for that piece of content. For example, a navbar component will contain a template which makes up the HTML for this bit of content, but also in JavaScript logic like function which runs when maybe a logout button is clicked, maybe when login button is clicked. So the function will run. The React components allow us to do these things really easily. So to begin with, in our application, we only have one single component which is being rendered, and that is this component right here, this app. By the way, I'm inside this index.js file and inside the source folder, and this is the file. Remember, this is the file kickstarts our application. At the minute, what it's doing is taking this app component right here and it's rendering it to the DOM. So this position, so the element with id of root, this component right here, all of the content inside that component is being rendered to the browser, and that's what we are seeing right here. All of this content is this content over here. So this component, known as the root component, we will talk more about what the root components means later on, but essentially this is only component at the minute, and this is the only component which is being rendered to the DOM. And inside this component we can see it is basically a function called app, and that returns what looks like some HTML code. Now this function could be an arrow function if you prefer, but it has to start with this capital letter. So this one is called app, and it returns this code right here. Like I said, it looks like HTML template, and that is all of the content we are seeing over here, but this is not the HTML. It's basically called a JSX. Now it has a syntax almost identical to the HTML, but there are some differences which we are going to talk about later on. So the JSX allows us to easily create these HTML styles templates and components, and in background a transpiler called Babel converts all of this JSX file template into the HTML. When we save the file, and it renders the HTML to the DOM, so you don't have to worry about too much how this happens, but just know that this kind of a thing is going on in the background. And this template code right here, JSX. Now one big difference between JSX and HTML is the way we add classes to elements, because in JSX we use this attribute class name is also camel case. Notice it is in capital. Now the reason we can't just use just class is because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, and at the end of the day we are in JavaScript file right here. So we can't use class, we use this class name in JSX, and then when this is converted here, this is converted into the HTML, it changes this attribute into just a class. If we inspect this over here, we are going to see it should be a class of an app. So it doesn't say class name, it just says class. Okay, so that's one difference, and there are other differences between them as well, which we'll see later on. Now one thing I want to quickly mention here, in the older versions of React, like version less than version 17, you need to import React at the top of this inside components for them to work. Notice we don't have import React anywhere up here. We import these other things but not React. If you are using version 16 for example, and not the latest version, for this to work, you might see in your file there's something like this. You import React from React like this, and then this file would work. But in the version 17 and later, we don't need to do that. Okay, that's important if you're using older version. So there is one more thing I want to do in this video, and that's to remove this most of this template content right here. And so everything inside this div with the class name of app, we will keep this to surround our code. So we have to return this template inside a component, right? And now we have this empty div, but also we want to inside that div with the class of contents or div.content. And this was the emmet setup I was talking about earlier in the first video. Because now if I press tab, I'm going to create that div with the class name of content. Alright, so inside that I'm going to do an h1 that's just going to say app components like so. And now I'm going to save this, and in fact we can take away this import for the logo, and we used that before inside the template, so but we don't anymore. So let's get rid of that and save the file. Now if we come to the browser and we see this very simple template, And also we can delete this logo over here. We are not going to be using it in our project. Get rid of that as well. So this thing right here, this is just one single component, and I said before that a React website can be made of many different components. So later on we will be adding more components to this as well, but in the next video I will talk about little bit more about the template and how we can output dynamic values inside the template. But before we move on, just one more thing I want to mention, that this thing right at the bottom of the file here, the export. So at the end we always export our component function, so that when we can use it in the other files. And right here inside this index.js we are doing exactly that. We import this app component from /app. So this file we are using it right here, and this then being rendered to DOM using the React DOM library. Okay, so a component in a nutshell is a function, and then we always must return something inside that function. Generally that's going to be a JSX template, and then at the bottom we export that component so we can use it elsewhere as well. So that's all in this tutorial. See you in the next one. So we have single component so far in our web app, and in this tutorial we are going to learn about the multiple component in the React. Now so far we have a single component in our application, and that is this one right here, this app.js, and this is known as the root component of the application, meaning it's the first component that gets rendered to the DOM, and it sits at the very top of our application, and is the thing that this index file renders right here. Now in React application, so the components are structured in a way that makes up the component tree. Now the root component sits at the top of this tree, and this is the component that is initially rendered inside our HTML file. Then if we were to make more components, we nest them inside this root one here. So if we made components for a navbar or the sidebar or the footer, all of those components would be nested inside this root app components. And then if we make further components, they could be nested inside this one as well. So this makes our components in component tree. And we are going to start by just making a navbar component, which is going to sit inside our root app component at the top. To make a new component, the first thing we need is new file, now which I'm going to make inside the source folder. So this will be called navbar and .js. Now remember, a component is just a function which returns a JSX template, and then that function is exported at the bottom of the file. Now remember that the package I told you to install to VS Code, which was called simple React snippets, this thing over here, well, I'm going to use a snippet to create a functional component right here. So this is FC and then tab, and it creates what's known as a stateless functional components. So all I need to do is give this a name, which I'm going to call this navbar with a capital N, and then we have our boilerplate component. Now notice this time that this is an arrow function, unlike this one. Now it doesn't matter, like I said, it can be an arrow function if you prefer, and I generally create arrow functions for my components, but either way it doesn't matter. So inside here we now need to return some kind of a template. So the first thing I'm going to do is a nav with a class of navbar, and then inside that I'm going to do an h1, and h1 is going to say the coder web app. So and below the h1 I will do another div with a class of links, and these are going to be links in our navigation. So let's do an anchor tag for the first one. That's going to go to just /, which is ultimately be the home page, and we will say home for the text, and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to change the href right here to / create. So we will just type here new app, and now at the minute this is not going to work because we are not set up multiple pages or anything like that yet. Okay, but for now we just want some content output to the browser. That's pretty much it. So that's our template for navbar, and we are exporting this function at the bottom. So now what we need to do is import this navbar into this app root component and then nest it somewhere inside this template. So the first thing we need to do is import it. So I can say import the navbar, and it's going to be from and then it's a // to say the current directory, and the navbar we don't need to say .js when we are using this import, it figures itself out. Okay, so now we can nest it down here, and I'm going to nest it just above the content div right here, because all of the page content will ultimately go inside here, but the navbar I'm going to place above that. Now to do this, we just say navbar and then close this tag, so it's self-closing. You can do an opening and closing tag as well if you prefer. Save this and it works. We can see that navbar component at the top. So let me just show you the other way. If we were to do a closing tag instead, save that and refresh, this still works. So I generally go with the self-closing tag instead. Okay, so that's our second component. Now we have two components. We have the app root one and the navbar, which is nested inside the root component. Now I also want to do a component for the home page content, because I don't just want to create it all inside this root component. So I want to make a separate component for the content of home page. So let me do that by first of all creating a new file called home.js, and then inside here another stateless functional component. Press tab and I'm going to call this home. Now inside this parenthesis I'm going to return template, a div with a class of home, and I'm applying these classes to later on we can style them in CSS. Inside this we will just do an h2 that says home page, and that will do for now. So again I want nested now inside this component. So the first thing I need to do is import it. So import home from /home, and then I can nest it down here inside this div. So I'm going to get rid of this h1 and instead output the home component just as a tag, and now we should see the content of on the page. So that's how we create multiple different components and then import them into other components and nest them. If I wanted to, I could also create a further component and nest it inside one of these I have just created, like the navbar, and we are going to see more of these as we go forward. But next up I want to take a look at using the CSS in our project. So yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you. Dynamic values in React. So another good thing about a JSX template in React is that we can output dynamic values or variables inside it. But first let's just put this h1 tag inside this div tag. So yeah, so imagine we wanted to output a web app title on the screen, right? Well, yeah, we could hard code it right here. We could just write it in h1. We can also output a variable instead right here. Now we can create the variable inside the function before the return template. So I'm going to say const, and then we will call this title and set it equal to something. By the way, you can write any valid JavaScript inside this function before we return the JSX template. So all of this is fine, and I'm going to set this equal to welcome to the new web app. If I want to output this value, this variable inside the template, all I need to do is use this curly braces and then the variable name. So when we use curly braces like this, where React knows we want to output a dynamic value of variable, so it's just going to look for the value of this variable of here, and it's going to output that right here inside the h1. So if I save this and preview, we can see that value on the screen. Now we can also output multiple values inside this template right here. All we have to do is create them at the top. So I could create another one called visits, and then set that equal to something like 50, and then down here I'm going to do a paragraph tag and say visited. then the curly braces to output variable visited, and then I will say times. So it should say visited 50 times. If I save this and preview, then we can see it here. Now notice that this time it's a number and not a string, but that doesn't matter because React is going to convert whatever data type that we use to a string before it outputs to the browser. So we could use an array if we wanted to, so it would just convert that to a string and then output it. The only thing we can't output are booleans or object. So for example, if I try to create a constant called employee and set it equal to an object in here, and we will have a name which is James, and also an age property which is going to be 26. If now I try to output this down here, paragraph tag and then employee like so, if I save this and come over here, I'm going to refresh. Notice we get an error. We cannot output this object. So numbers, strings and arrays are fine, but booleans and object we can't use. So let me just comment this out so they don't cause an error, and save it. Now, as well as outputting variables, we can also write the dynamic values directly in curly braces. So for example, I could write any kind of JavaScript statement inside these curly braces that returns a valid value, either a string or a number or an array. So let me just do a number like this and it outputs 10. Let me do another example, another paragraph tag, and this time I want to output a string. Well, we just use quotes for that, and I say hello like so and save it, and we can see that string. I'm going to output an array, so curly braces and then an array inside here, and I will just say 1 2 3 4 and 5 and save that, and we can see this array. All it does is bunch all of these different elements in an array together, and it's output those as a string. And then after this we can also output like evaluations like this. I could use the math object dot random and then maybe times that by 10 like so, and so it's just going to evaluate this, which returns us a number, and it's going to output that number as a string in the browser. So if I save this, we can see that we get a random number. If I refresh, it's going to be a different number each time around. Okay, so another thing we can do in JSX is use these dynamic values as attribute values in element tags. So for example, we could have an anchor tag, and this is an href attribute. Now normally we have put the attribute as a string right here to a website, for example http.google.com like so, and I'm just going to say over here Google Sites. But in JSX this can be a dynamic value, so I could cut this and store it in a variable at the top over here. Const link is equal to string we just created, and then down here if I want to use a dynamic value for an attribute, I just use curly braces. So you don't need the quotes first and then curly braces, it's just curly braces, and then we put dynamic value inside the curly braces. So the name of the constant link, for example, if I save this now and come over here, I'm going to inspect this to make sure we have the right href. Yes, so it's popped in the dynamic value to the href right here. Now at the moment things like this might seem a little bit pointless, but later on when you start working with the dynamic data, then it becomes very useful. For example, you might have list of web application title from the database, and each title must be a link. Now that link is going to be dynamically output for each web app, because each web app should click through a different web details page, right? So we are going to see more of this as we go forward. So yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you. Alright then, so we have our three different components now. We have the root component, this app.js, and the home component, and also the navbar component. Now I like to do is add some CSS to these components. But how do we do that? Well, if we take a look at this root component, we have already see this import app.css, and it's coming from this css file right here. So when we created the boilerplate React application, it came with these styles for the root component over here. Now anything inside the app.css file will be applied to not only to these app.js components, but also any component in the browser at that time. That's because React just takes all of these styles and adds them to the head of the web page. So if we take a look over here, if we inspect and go to the elements and take a look inside the head, we are going to find styles tag at some point with all of those styles inside them. It's this one right here. So bear in mind, these styles, if we import them into a component, are not only going to style what's in that component, but it also styles anything else that has been displayed on the page at that time as well. So it doesn't really scope the styles to single component. You could use something called CSS modules to scope your styles, or use something called styled components, but that's not something I want to get into right now. But maybe in the future I will do a separate tutorial for that. So having separate CSS files for different components, but a lot of time when I'm doing smaller projects, I just have a single CSS file, this index.css file right here, and add pretty much all of my CSS into that file. And this would kind of like a global style sheet, and it would app all the components. So this index.css file is then imported into this index.js file right here, and what this does is it takes all of those styles and adds them inside the head again, and it's going to appear on it all the time. So if you look at this, it's the first styles tag, and is this stuff right here, and that's generally the approach I'm going to be taking for this project. So what I'm going to do is actually delete this app.css file and then delete its component right here. Make sure you do that as well, otherwise you will get an error, and then save it. And then going forward, I'm just going to use this index.css file for all of my styles. The first thing I'm going to do is delete this current content, and then I'm going to paste in. First of all, let's go to Google Fonts and search for quicksand. Now here you can see, and then copy this font from here and paste it here. So that's the Google font I'm going to use for this project, this quicksand. Next I'm going to copy and paste base styles, because I'm pretty sure you don't want to watch me and type out bunch of CSS anyway. I will quickly go through them. Right here I'm targeting every element with asterisks and stripping out the margin, applying a font family of quicksand, which is this and color of a gray. Now the navbar right here, which remember is the thing of here, I'm styling that, giving it some padding, displaying as flex, aligning the items to the center, and that's we give this max with a margin and 0 auto. We also give it border bottom as well. The h1 in the navbar, we make this pink color. The links we say margin left auto, and that shoots them over to the right because the parent is displayed as flex. And then the anchor tags, we say margin left 16 pixel, and we take away the text decoration and give them some padding. When we hover over those links, we turn them red color. And then the content, which remember is right here, so it's surrounding the home component at the minute. So we say right here, give this max width of 600 pixels and margin, and then a padding of 20 pixels. So some very simple styles. Now if I come over here and refresh, we should see those styles take effect. So yeah, you can see that here. So that looks a little bit nicer. There is one more thing I want to show you, and that's how to add some inline styling. Let's do that inside the navbar components, and we will style this link right here. So in regular HTML we can do a style property and we set it equal to a value which is a string, and then add the different CSS properties in here. Now we can do a similar thing inside JSX as well, but this time it can be a dynamic value. When we want a dynamic value, we use curly braces, and now the value of this is going to be an object in itself. So we need another pair curly braces inside outer ones. Okay, so inside this object we do different key value pairs. The key is going to be CSS property, and the CSS value for the property. So for example, I could say color for the key, and then the value is always string, and in our case it's going to be white for this link, and then we do a comma and do another key. So for example, background color, now this is where it gets different, because in CSS it's background hyphen color, but remember we are in JavaScript file and this looks like a minus sign, so we don't do this when we are using JSX. For CSS we just camel case it like this background color, and we set that equal to a value. Now I'm going to use the same hex code as this over here, so let me copy that and paste it in, and then finally we will do one more. We will give this border radius again camel case, and we will set that equal to 8 pixels. Alright, and so this is how we do inline styling, a dynamic value which is an object with a key value pairs. And if we save this and preview, now we can see this has taken effect, and you can see it here. So I'm not going to be keeping that style, so I'm just going to delete all of that, but I did want to show you how to do that in case if you want to do that for some of your elements. So yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you. So alright, hello and welcome back to this React props tutorial. In this tutorial we will cover everything you need to know about the props in React. So first let's define what the props are. So the props stands for properties in React. So these props are used to pass data from one component to another component. So these props are read only, which means that the data passed down cannot be modified by the receiving component. And also these components receive props exactly like an ordinary function argument in JavaScript. Like in JavaScript we use functions, and in that function we use arguments. Just like that, the components have these props. So we will explore most of the concepts of props and how they work in React. We will cover 2 examples to demonstrate the difference between rendering the data without props and rendering the data with props. And at the end of the example you will learn why props are important and why we need to use them. So first example, I'm going to render the data without using props. So let's start with the example. So I will create one component. Here suppose you have to add your company employees data in this component, so I will name it example, and this example component So one way to do this is by hard coding the data like this. I will include data for only 3 employees. Here is our all hard coded data. We have to render this data into this component. So I will render this data in this component. So let's see how it works. And it works okay, but this approach works for small applications or example, but in real world scenarios and in large applications we often need to render this data dynamically, and we can't hard code every single data in the component, right? We can't add every employee's detail like this hard coded, right? So if you want to update the data, we will have to do it inside the component itself like this, and this is not efficient work. There is no reusability here, and also we can't add data dynamically. So this is why we use props. So let me show you how we use props. Let me comment this elements, and let's do this in a more reusable and efficient manner using the props. So you know what, let me just comment this whole component out so you don't get confused by it. And let's create the new component, and I'm going to name it example2. Now here we will use the props. So example2 component will take the props as its parameter, and now let's use this props parameter with our each element. So props name, age, and props job, like that. So we use props to display the employee's name, age, and job. This is like a template, and now what we have to do is pass the values in these props name, props age, and props job parameter. So we have to pass the values from our parent component, and our parent component is this home right here. This home is our parent component, so I will pass the values in here. So first let's render the example component here and example, and now in here I will pass the value. So first props parameter name, and I will give John as its value, then age, and then the job, and I will give it a value. Okay, now let's create another employee data, and here the same thing again, name, and then age, and then the job. And now let's create the third one, again the name, age, and job. So we have created 3 employees data here, and let's see how it works. In here you can see we have 3 employees data, and it works just fine. So the difference between this example and the earlier example is by doing it with the props, we can dynamically pass the data to the example component and easily create any number of employees. We no longer need to hard code the data for each employee like this. We have to hard code the data here, but we don't need that anymore. Instead we just use example component as a template and pass the values as props from the parent component. So if we want to create a 4th employee, we just have to pass the values in the same way as we did for others. And now let's create the 4th employee. So I will give it a name, and then the age, and then the job. So this is our 4th employee, and you can create any number of employees here using these props. Now let's take a look at how it displays in the browser, and here is the new data, and it's looking good. So that's all in this tutorial. I hope this tutorial has been informative and that you have gained a better understanding of how props work in React. In the upcoming tutorial we will explore the topic of props more deeply. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Hello and welcome back to this props project. In this project we are going to build a simple project using React props. In our project we are going to use 2 functional components that will display information about the books. Now let's say you want to add books in your library and you want to keep the data of each book you added. Now one way to do this is by hard coding each book, the data of the book, and that's not the efficient way, and we are not going to do that way. We are going to do this in more reusable and efficient way using React props. So here is what you have to build. So this project requires you to create 4 props, one for book title, one for the book author, one for the description of the book, and one for the date. And your task is to pass these 4 props from one component to another component. So do this project on your own. If you encounter any difficulties, then you can refer back to this tutorial for the guidance. So give it a try and good luck. I hope you have done well. Congratulations. Now let's proceed to build this project. Firstly we need 2 components, and we already have the parent component, which is this home component. And now let's create another component so we can pass the props. Now I'm going to name this component library, and in here we have to create props, and I'm going to create div element with the class name of card. So I used a class name so we can style the div, and let's give this div a little style in the css file. So I will create one css file here, and we will not waste time on styling this element. We will just add few style elements so it will not look ugly and look more presentable to you. And also you will get an idea of how props work with the css and the dynamic styling based on the data passed from one component to another component. So here I'm just adding some styling like display margin, then the height, width, also the background color, border. Yeah, this is just a basic styling. This home is the class name of div. This div is in our home component, so here this div, so I just added some css to it. So now let's go back to the component and create 4 parameters, one for the title of the book, and one for the author, one for the description, and one for the date. So props title in the h2 tag, and props author in the h3 tag, then the props description, and I will use p tag for the description. Now date, also I'm going to use p tag here. And we have created the template, but we have to attach this to parent component. In our case, home component is our parent component. In here we have to render the library component in this home component. So in here library, and I'm going to add the first book title, then the author, and then the description, and date. That's it. That's our first book, and let's go for the second one. So again, the title, The Great Gatsby, and the author, then the description, then the date. So that's our second book. Now let's add the third one. So here I'm going to add the third book. So we have added 3 books here. Now let's see how it's looking in the output. We have the books here with the author name, title, and everything in this card. So these props are dynamic, and dynamic means that I don't have to create separate styles or separate elements for this book. All I have to do is put new data in the parent component and it will get added, so I don't have to create the separate elements. So let's add one more, so you will get the idea. Title, I'm going to add this 4th book here. And all the info. So that's it. So let's see how it works, and here you can see we have the result and it's working just fine. Okay then, so in our project so far we haven't talked about state or data much. Now when we talk about the state of a component, we just mean the data being used in that component at that point in time. So now that state could be an array of values, booleans, strings, objects, or any other data that our component uses. So now we created some variables and we used them in our templates before, which worked fine. But what if we had variables or data that we wanted to change over time, or in reaction to some event like user clicking a button? Well, let's first of all try now. So notice at the minute I still have this button which references this handle click function, and there is nothing in there at the minute. Now let's create a variable. I'm going to say let and name equal to John, and then what I want to do is output this name inside the template. So p tag and then output the name. So now if I preview this, it's going to show that name, and it works here. You can see that. But what if when I click on this button I want to change this name? Okay, so let's try it. So this references this function right here. So inside the function I could take the name and update it to Doe, like DOE, Doe, like so. And then what do you think will happen here? Do you think when I click on this button it will change the name? So well, let's give this a try. And if I click on this button, it doesn't change in the template. You can see here it's not changing. Now the name itself changes, and I can demo that by logging into the console. If we click on this, we see Doe here. Here you can see the Doe. It is changing in this console, but it doesn't update in the template. Now it doesn't update in the template because the variable that we created over here is not reactive. So in order for this to work, we use something called a hook, and that hook is called useState. So in order to use this useState hook, first of all we need to import it at the top of our file. So we say import, then the curly braces, that is the form of React libraries, and now we can use it inside our component. So let me just comment out this stuff and also delete this inside handle click, and instead we are going to make reactive value using this useState hook. And now let me put a const in here, and in this const I'm going to put this array destructuring. Don't get confused by it. I'm going to explain all of this in just a sec. So this name is a variable, and it holds the initial value of the state. In our case the initial value is this John. We have assigned the initial value here in this useState to John. So this name has initial value of John, and it will change, and this set name is a function, and it is used to change this initial value. It will change the value of John to something else. So how can we change this value? So I already told you this set name is a function, so we have to invoke this function, and here I'm going to put this set name in this function and assign it a updating value. So let's say we are updating this John to something like Doe, like so. And let me explain once again what we are doing here. So this one is array destructuring, and this name is a variable, and this set name is a function, and we have assigned this name initial value of John, and we updated that value in this set name function, and it is Joe. So now we have to use button. So here I'm going to use button, and I'm going to put event like on click, and in this on click I am going to put this function. So after clicking this button it will invoke this function. Also what I want to do is, first of all let's try this in the console.log. Let me click this button. So here you can see this. Once I click the button, this John is changing to Doe. Let's go back, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a p tag here, and the p tag here that is used to display our name on the web page. And here we have John, and it is the initial value, and once I click on this button the value is changed, and it is changed to Doe, as you can see here. So this is all it is in this useState. It is a hook, and it allows us to track the state of a function component, and this name is a variable, and this set name is a function, and you can name them anything. It doesn't have to be this name and set name. You can name them anything. Also, one more important thing here, you can use any data type in this use state. You can use arrays, you can use booleans, strings, numbers, it doesn't matter. So now let's go to solve the quiz of use state. So it's quiz time, and in this quiz we have to build the increment and decrement counter using use state. So pause the video and try to build this counter, and come back here to see the answer. If you have completed the quiz without any help, then congratulations to you. And if you didn't complete the quiz, don't worry, I got you. Alright, let's build this React counter. First things first, let's put const here, and again you already know this. This is array destructuring, and let's name it. So as you already know, you can name them anything, but for our own convenience I'm going to name it count, and the function will be set count. So this count is a variable and set count is a function. Okay, so we have to assign this in this use state. So use state, and we have to assign the initial value of count. So you can start from any value, but I'm just going to start from 0. This 0 is this count variable here. Alright, we have to put a function here to increment our initial value of 0 by 1. So for that function, here you can put arrow function or regular function. I'm just going to put the regular one, and in this function what we need to do is increment the value by 1. So to update it, update the value, set count, and in this set count we have to increase it by 1, right? So count plus 1, this is it for increment. Now let's put a button here, and in this button the event like on click, let's put this increase function here, and once this button is clicked, this function will be invoked. What we also need here is a p tag to display our count value. In this p tag, just the count. And now let's see how it works. Here the initial value is 0, as you can see, and once I clicked on this button, it is incrementing, it is increasing by 1. As you can see, it is increasing by 1. So this current layout appears a little crowded, so I will add some spacing between these elements. So let me make those adjustments now. The layout is now easier to read, and it's also looking decent as well. So now let's move on to the next step in our quiz project, and that is building the decrement counter. So the process of building the decrement counter is quite simple. We need to create another function. I'm going to call it decrement count. So in this function we will use this set count function here. Okay, so it will update the count value. We need to decrease the count value by 1. So count minus 1, this is it for this function. And after defining this decrement count function, we need to call this function when a specific event is triggered, just like we did here in this increment count function with this button. So to do this, we will use button and on click event to invoke the decrement count function, and that's it. With these changes in place, our initial count state will now change based on which function is called, either increment count or decrement count function. So let me just put the space between these elements, and now let's see how it works now. And here the initial state is 0, and once I click on the increment, it's increasing, and after I click on this decrement, it is decreasing by 1. So this is our React counter using useState. If you want, you can style these elements and make it look a little better. So in this tutorial, we have completed our React useState quiz project. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.